We are also following some breaking news right now in the war in Ukraine. That's after a day of meetings between U.S. and Ukrainian officials. Ukraine is agreeing to support the Trump administration's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. And the U.S. will immediately resume military assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. In a joint statement, both the U.S. and Ukraine said the ceasefire is also subject to Russia's approval. Here is Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking after that meeting.
We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, that they'll say yes to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
And moments ago, President Trump also confirmed the agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine.
That's a total ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed to it, and hopefully Russia will agree to it. We're going to meet with them later on today and tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be able to wipe out a deal. But I think the ceasefire is very important.
NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons is joining us now from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where that meeting between the U.S. and Ukraine just wrapped up. Keir, walk us through this major announcement.
Well, it was a surprise. It's fairly short, the statement that was released. The two headlines, I guess, are Ukraine signing up to that 30-day ceasefire if Russia agrees to it, and then the fact that the U.S. has put back in place sharing intelligence information and security support. What isn't in the statement tonight are details of exactly what kind of security Ukraine might get. You'll remember that disaster in the Oval Office between President Trump and President Zelensky was fueled by Ukraine and President Zelensky's insistence that Ukraine needed security guarantees. The statement tonight does talk about guaranteeing Ukrainian prosperity and security, but it doesn't say how. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have not been enthusiastic about a quick ceasefire with very little else agreed, because Ukraine is worried that it would be left vulnerable. And then there are the Russians, and as you mentioned, President Trump tonight saying that they are going to now turn to the Russians. Secretary of State Rubio saying, OK, now the spotlight is on the Russians. But the Russians have been successful, relatively speaking, in the war in recent months, including managing to inch their way into the territory that was taken by the Ukrainians in the Russian region of Kursk. Now, the Russians may think that if they keep fighting, they can get that territory back. So why would they stop? And everything depends not just on the Russians, really, but also on the Trump administration's ability to negotiate with Moscow, to drive a hard bargain, to not concede too much with President Putin. President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who met with President Putin last month for 3.5 hours, according to his account, is going to go back to Moscow this week to talk to the Russians again. We'll see.
Yeah, I have to ask you, though, you talk about the fact that this announcement was a bit surprising. I think there weren't expectations that there would be big deliverables from this particular meeting. I would imagine that this would also be a surprise to the Russians. Any indication at this point, I know it's early, about how the Kremlin is viewing this deal and whether it would agree to sit down and actually talk through it, whether it would agree to a potential 30-day ceasefire?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard from the Russians yet. That's not surprising. They do tend to take their time in these situations. They certainly have been signaling that they're not in a hurry for a ceasefire or for a meeting, say, for example, between President Trump and President Putin. The Kremlin spokesman earlier today talked about people with rose-colored glasses about the new relationship between Russia and the US, and saying Russia will look after its own security interests. So you can imagine that the Russians will want to talk, but they will also want to hold a line about the kinds of things that they expect. One of them, for example, and it's not in the statement at all, is what happens to the territory. How much territory remains under Russia's control?
All right, Keir Simmons for us in Saudi Arabia on a late night there. Keir, we appreciate you. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.